Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the CSG Justice Center's Fieldwide webinar, Beyond Data Warehouses, a Better Way to Share Data. Joining us for this webinar will be our two representatives from the IJIS Institute, Steve Ambrosini and Bob May. Thank you all for being here today. We do appreciate you joining us. Please do keep in mind it is best to keep yourselves on mute while the presentations are happening. If you have any questions, please utilize the chat box and we will be able to look at those questions during our discussion time. So my name is Ethan Aronson and I'm going to be leading this webinar for you all today. Here we have our presentation outline. We're going to go through some introductions, a bit of welcome, and then we will get started on our subject matter, which is going to be data sharing and integration and the differences between what we are discussing today, secure data environments and data warehouses. And so you can see here what we'll be covering. Joining us today, we have Steve Ambrosini, Program Director from the IJIS Institute, as well as Bob May, Program Director also from the IJIS Institute. My name is Ethan Aronson. I'm a Policy Analyst with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I work in the Behavioral Health Division on the law enforcement team. And supporting us today is Julia Kessler, who is a project manager also at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. She will be monitoring the chat and assisting. And so a little bit about what the CSG Justice Center is and what we do. We are a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we combine the power of a membership association with policy and research expertise in order to increase public safety and strengthen communities, provide technical assistance, and have published a number of very useful resources recently. We bring people together, we drive the criminal justice field forward with our research and our publications. We really utilize our relationships in the criminal justice and behavioral health spaces to build momentum for policy change, all while providing assistance to a number of federal grantees and other organizations. By all means, you should check out our website and take a look at our publications, as well as sign up for our newsletter. We are always putting out really interesting and useful information that I encourage you to take advantage of. Our goals are to break the cycle of incarceration and advance health, opportunity, and equity, all while using data to improve safety and justice. And now I'm going to pass it over to Bob, who's going to tell you a little bit about the IJIS Institute. Bob?
Thank you, Ethan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you today. Just want to take a minute or two to talk about the IJIS Institute. We're a nonprofit alliance that promotes and enables technology in the public sector to expand the use of information sharing and maximize safety, efficiency, and productivity. We advocate for policies and processes for information standards that impact our safety and security. We try to build a knowledge base for our stakeholders and connect public and private sectors. Next slide, please. Our members are people from the information technology industry and practitioners. And we bring them together at the table to define and refine solutions that work for the practitioner community and also meet their needs. Some of the sectors we work in, you can see here: criminal justice, law enforcement, public safety, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, school safety, and transportation. We've just expanded. It's really hard it's hard to talk about information sharing and exclude a sector. And we found that it just has flown across all the sectors. Next slide, please, Ethan. And you can see from this slide is a sample of some of the projects that we've been engaged in to get a flavor for what we've been up to. But relevant to this discussion, we've worked in the NIBRS, law enforcement incident-based information reporting, corrections reentry, justice and health information sharing, one of our big projects, gang intelligence, child care and background checks, nationwide suspicious activity reporting, and PREA data standards development. And of course, recently working with CSG on law enforcement mental health collaboration projects, this project here, and working in our advisory committees, law enforcement imaging technology and law enforcement advisory committee, and a number of other committees. These committees consist of members from the solution industry and practitioners. That's where the real work gets done, and we work out problems. Recently, we've updated the RMS standards for police information systems. They hadn't been updated in almost, I think, 13 years. So we try to take on things that need to be done to enhance and improve information sharing and push that ball down the road. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ethan.
Thank you, Bob. And so now we're going to get into the real meat of our presentation today, which is going to be focused on secure data environments. And for that, Steve is going to be our main presenter. And so I'm going to advance this and pass it over to Steve. And here we go.
Thank you, Ethan, and thanks to the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about what, if you look at the bottom of the screen, if you can read it, it talks about sort of the difference between there's different ways we can do things around sharing data. And so I'm going to contrast just a little bit under this particular heading, the difference between what we'll call data warehousing and what we've been introducing, which is an active data integration environment. And my background is all technology, and I'm now in my third major generation of technologies that have been doing this stuff. But I've spent most of my time in the justice sector, and then after September 11th in the counterterrorism sector. But more recently, I decided to start trying to do some work that I thought, I have grandkids now, and I started doing work in the school safety arena. And it's been really eye-opening to learn about, some of the new, they're very new areas to me in the human services and health world. And seeing how that now comes together, with, really multiple dimensions of the justice system. We have law enforcement, we have investigative services, we have, all of the supervised release services, which all come into play in this. And I'm strictly right now talking about schools in the K-12 region, because we've had, as we all know, since Columbine, we've had some pretty awful incidents to have to live with. And so everything we can do to use data to help, with one of my partners who's on this call today, we've talked and always said that if we could just, save one kid with what we're doing, that it'd all be worthwhile. So that's what I do today, and found it really interesting to start looking at a different approach. And we were in the midst, by the way, of a big data warehousing project in Silicon Valley when we decided we have this thing called the internet, which is a robust and resource laden type of environment to be able to do data communications and do the kind of things we need to do to move things around. So when we look at, we really focus on data integration in this comment here to actively share data from multiple systems in a unified view. And simply stated, what that means is we don't have to move this data and store it anywhere else. We want to have, absolute persistence with the data that we're working with. So we know when we get the data from, the case management systems that we're working with, we know it's current, we know it's being taken care of, and we know it's serving the communities that we're trying to work with. Ethan, let's go to the next one. So we call what we're building a secure data environment, and I'll explain more of that in a minute here when I talked to you about what our, our key design and architecture principles were. But, at the top of that list is privacy and confidentiality. And we've literally spent some time, this is going to sound a little bit overstated, but it's not, looking around the world at how data was being protected. This is a bit different than what we typically look at as in terms of how we protect things. We've always been heavily focused on, controlling access to systems and those kinds of things. That's been, in fact, it has a name. It's called InfoSec, or information security. But data protection is about, regardless of how you're handling the data, is recognizing its sensitivities as well as what's required for compliance with federal regulations, with state laws, and a lot of times within the county and big city jurisdictions, they have additional rules that have to be applied. So we decided we had to develop an architecture that we call policy and technology. And again, I have a partner who I work with who's he's an attorney, and he's also very well versed in what goes on. We've worked in a couple of different states, California being the biggest one when we were doing work in Silicon Valley. And, his job is to make sure he creates what I like to call the legal architecture for what we're doing, and that we completely, join that with the technology architecture. And so we will often refer to what we build in these secure data environments as integrated policy and data frameworks. And so that's a big part of what we do. And so when we look at, what the purpose and objectives of the secure data environment is, it's going to seem real simple because it is, but it's about improving the coordination of services across agencies. So when we're dealing with kids and we're dealing with families, and we have, someone, let's say Ethan, became the subject of the juvenile probation department. And, we know he's in school because he's in 8th grade. And, we've got so we know at least, when we're looking at how we're coordinating services, we don't want the child and the family being treated by an agency that doesn't have any idea what other agency might be working with them. And we see this is a big subject today for all of us. And we see it very, it's very large in public health, and when a kid's being, in some kind of treatment with health, and they're also say, they're under, supervision by probation, and they're a student in school, anything that you might be thinking about with that kid is going to come out better if all those agencies are able to talk to each other and be aware immediately that they're all working with this child. And so some of the complexity within what we're doing is about being able to do, we have a very sophisticated method and tool set that comes from an outside provider, but is actually inherent in what we're doing. And that's the ability to do identity matching. And it's absolutely essential, because there might be more than one person named Ethan in another organization. So we want to make sure we get the one we're looking for. So let's go ahead, Ethan. Go ahead, next. There we are. So this is the concept. This is I like to call these cartoons, because they don't look like system architecture diagrams, but they're very, and I'm going to just tell you what you're looking at here. On the left side of the diagram, you're looking at a set of agencies that includes law enforcement, corrections, emergency services, public health, and human services. Now, this one is done for a different environment. This one's being done for work we're doing in opioid recovery. And so those are the agencies that are working with us there. And that opioid recovery is all adult work. But the path that the data works down through this is the same, whether it's school safety or whether it's opioid recovery or any other area, because everything is driven by the data that is needed and the agencies that are participating. And so, I don't know if you can read it, but we start with an access control point that really is that's the traffic cop that sits there and decides who gets in and who gets, who doesn't, because, we have to, the agencies themselves authorize their own staff to come in, and they come in through their own identity provisioning. We don't manage their identities, but once we validate that they are authorized by their agency, that's when we come into something called the data exchange portal. And from there, that's now the router for everything we've got to do. And if you look to the right side, you'll see something called data integration. And that's where the data integration exchanges happen with it's the same systems, but it's a different exchange at that point. And that's where, when I was talking earlier, we are doing this because we want to be able to get the most current, again, the consistent persistence with the data as it comes back to the portal and then is delivered to the user. So next, Ethan. So now I'm going to just give you this kind of a little bit of a quick pass on this, because I think it's important that you have, an understanding of some of the things we did that I think are a little bit different than what I'll call a standard system development life cycle. So what we did here is, we set up a schedule, because this is a project like every other project. But it's essential that we have program governance and executive oversight. So the governance piece is it's really, it's task number 2. And then we go to in task 3, I was mentioning earlier about the policy and legal requirements for cross-agency data sharing. Just share a little anecdote with you, but in California, we were doing work that was going to cross, it wasn't just going to cross agencies, it was going to cross 4 agencies across 3 counties. And so it was a new challenge, and California law didn't allow it. So our team, the team that, and it's not just IGES, it was the what we called the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust team, actually went to the state assembly with a request to change that law. And I think certainly to my surprise, it was changed within 3 months. So sometimes you get into these things and you realize, well, instead of saying we can't do that, you kind of look at it and say, well, let's give it a shot, because this seems to make a lot of sense. And in the days when that law was passed, it made a lot of sense as well. But today we have the ability, again, it may sound silly, but with the internet, we can do a lot of things we could never do before. And we can be even more secure than when we didn't have the internet to do this stuff, because now it really enables one of the big things we do is we never expose any data. So we're always either translating that data into a different, it's not encrypting, but we're literally translating the data into the usable data, but we're never using the data that sits in the systems. So it's as we work through this, again, it's because we have this network that we can connect everything to without having to figure all that out as well. And again, I mentioned this integrated policy and data framework. That's where that piece comes in. Okay, Ethan, let's go up to the next one. Again, here's a project performance schedule. I think the interesting thing about this, when you look at it, these are I would say they're a common set of tasks we use every time we go into one of these programs. But you can see all of the overlap of the task, which means if we drew a bunch of vertical lines in this, you'd see all kinds of messages that are going back and forth, up and down as we move through this. And and at the center of it, there's we have the what we call the Enterprise Memorandum of Understanding, which is the overarching agreement to share. And then we have what we call and this is now where we bring the technology architecture in. And that's driven by something I'll mention again in a minute here, but we call it performance scenario analysis. And it's through that where we actually go through and it's a modeling process. We don't sit across a table and ask, what data do you need? What we do is we do it by creating real world scenarios that they face today that are really, they really identify the need for data. And that's how we do what's called data discovery. And so that's center of this thing, tasks 4 and 5. Actually, it's 3, 4, and 5 that actually allow us to do all of that. And then task 3 goes on past, the legal piece of it, because when it's all done, we still have to come back and validate that we're compliant. So that's it's a little bit of a rough story to see if you don't know you can't read what's there. But this is an approach that's worked very, very well for us. Okay, Ethan. So this is the performance scenario analysis I was just mentioning to you, and I'm just going to take a second to give you just a couple of pieces of this. We start with something we call impact stories, and we work with what we do when we establish the governance and organization, is we also establish by the different domains. So, for example, human services has their own set of subject matter experts that what we ask them to do is help us to assemble a small working group for human services out of their community. And so we work with each of those agencies and the working groups that they've assigned. And we talk through, tell us about, some of the things that we think, whether it's where we can make a difference or right now where we can't make a difference because we just don't have enough data or information, to be able to act quick enough. But it's all about really, we're in a constant circle around detection and intervention when there's a problem. And again, that's really big when we're dealing with the schools, because a lot of what happened, all the things we've seen happen in the schools, it's awful what's happened, but 75% of the kids who have lost their lives in schools have lost it due to suicide. And a lot of that is very simply because it's very tough sometimes if we're not, if we don't have the indicators, we don't have the things we need to be able to see, a pattern. Data discovery, I already talked about that, so I'm not going to go through that again, other than to say the impact stories trigger that initial set of data that we start looking at. And then what we do with that is we then start peeling it back and starting to look at all of the, what I'll call the subservient components of the data, so that ultimately we can get to the point where we can find that data in systems, because it tends to be, at a more constituent level than the way we talk about it in the systems analysis sessions. And then use cases. And use cases are a big thing for us because we actually use them to define requirements. In a similar way, with the impact stories, use cases are now the process through which we go to lower and lower levels of understanding. And, it's not unusual for us to have 60 or 70 use cases that we're working with that actually make up the requirements for data sharing in any one program. So the use cases become extremely important in that, and they help us to identify the data exchanges, which means the points that are connected to do the exchange, as well as the content of the data that's got to move across those connections. Go ahead, Ethan. So this one here is a little bit different than the other, what I call cartoon. So this is what we call the performance analysis workflow. And all this is really depicting is the fact that we start with those opioid or school safety use cases, as we've been talking about, and we just start moving through them. And if when you see we get down to I'm having trouble reading it myself, I'm sorry, but when we're looking at the policy data framework, we're now you can see it goes across. Thanks, Ethan. It goes across to the for us to conduct all of the data protection stuff, and it's and all that's done before we're able to deploy what we call the test environment, and then it's obviously from there. I don't know if you can move it over a little bit, because all our great looking pictures happen to be sitting in front of the terminal point, but that's okay. I think I've, that's that piece there that's, finishing this thing up is where we, this is where we pull all of the architecture becomes real. This is where it's automated. And so, we do, I think what's a very familiar development approach, in that we create an alpha demonstration environment, and that becomes the initial test environment. And then from there, it's positioned then to move to beta and start using that same test system with real production data, and then ultimately to a production environment. So for those of you systems analysts out there who are wondering, how we get from point A to point B. The important thing to remember, though, in point A to point B, and we're sure of this, is point B is a better place than point A. So if it wasn't, we wouldn't be putting this effort in. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, and this, I'm not going to really spend, I've already pretty much talked about this. I want to mention in bullet 2, I talk about enterprise and agency context models. That's our first, if you think of this as a funnel, that's the opening of the funnel. And then as we go down through that funnel, we get to the use case specifications, which is bullet 3. And I want to just give you an idea of what that looks like. So if you could, Ethan, we'll go to the next one. So this is pretty hard to read, but this is how we capture data, in the use case data capture framework. And I'll just tell you, but we define the scenario that, that we're building the use case around. We define the major data sets and then the data elements that are part of that. And then we go in and identify the involved agencies. And this one happens to be an opioid recovery one. So in this one, we're working with fire rescue, community corrections, and what they call an opioid task force. And then, where the source data that we're going to look, that's already, again, this is an important difference between warehousing the data and using the data as it exists in real life. So this is where we're identifying the data now that we have when we connect to, say, a human services system. This is the data that we're going to be looking to bring into this. And we put the sensitivity exposures and all those things on it. Like, in the case of the school safety, you guys all know this, but a juvenile's name is extremely protected, as well as any treatment or other involvement they have with any of the agencies that they're working with. So that, that's a high plus, that has to be kept confidential. So we'll never ever pull that data from an agency. We have just as a conceptual background, we use this very sophisticated person matching thing. And when we do the matches, we don't save anything other than we have the unique IDs of the kids kids or adults as they exist in the agencies they're in. And you guys all know this too. And if you haven't tried this yet, I would just say, here's a little piece of advice. I've tried it a couple of times when we're doing these multi-agency things, thinking that we need to create a common, unique identifier for people. It's literally, it's like getting a holding call, on third down in the NFL. It just kills everything. So, when we do this, when we do this, we make sure that we don't ask them ever to change their unique identifiers, because they also travel up and down the line from local to state to federal with those unique identifiers, and they're not going to change them. And it took me a long time to learn that. But so what we do is when we do a match, we take the unique identifiers from the two, let's say we find the same person in 3 agencies. We take the unique identifiers for that person from each agency, and we index them. And we keep them in what we call a vault. And it's a protected, it's a protected temporal storage area that there's only one way you can get to it, and that's through an SDE transaction. There's no master name index that you can run against it or anything else. And maybe if you're Julian Assange, you can, hack into it and do something like that. But at the end of the day, it's there's only one way in and one way out of it. So, but we use that to make sure, as I was talking earlier about, Ethan being in 2 agencies, when we go and find that, another person named Ethan, we're going to go to that index and look to see if the unique identifiers map to the same person. So we can go on to the next one. Okay, and this is the context model I mentioned a second ago. And this is more, I'm going to just say it's more of a systems analysis tool that we use. I'm not sure. We meet with users to make sure we're getting, the things right. But this is an overall what we call system data sharing view. So you see things here like the health department shares public health data. The human services group, they're doing community-based treatment data, et cetera. And but what we do with these is this is the overall. Then what we do is we put each agency in the middle and look at everything they share with those other agencies. And that gets us really started on, we correlate these with the impact stories. And that's what really gets us ready to go in now to starting to do the work to identify the more detailed data and capture it in the use cases. Okay, Ethan, we can jump. I think we already touched on this, Ethan. And so I'm going to say, let's pop ahead. Same thing here. I just thought it might be good. Go back to the one there just for a second. Just thought it might be good to remind you that what we're typically looking at here is a 2.5 to 3 year project when we do these things. Now, quite honestly, that's because that tends to be the duration of the grant funding that we've used to do this work. Almost all the work we've done, including the Silicon Valley work, which was funded by what's called the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and that is the same Zuckerberg. But the government grants tend to dictate a schedule of typically 2.5 to 3 years. That's how they spread the money. So, but anyways, that gives you, again, this just this is the same as the other one we just showed you. So. I think we're ready to go. I'm just looking at which ones now. So this is important because this is part of the, overall organization. And so we need to do things like we need to create the working groups, and we need to orient them to how the performance scenario analysis approach works. Creating the impact stories is something we always do because it's that initial use case, capture. We create rosters for the working groups. Again, these are things that if you were doing this work, you would be doing. Scheduling data discovery sessions. We prepare for these projects. We prepare the policy and legal documents, and my partner works with the councils from each agency we're working with. And so, sometimes we have a bigger team of lawyers than we do any other group. But it's worked well because I think he's on this call, so I don't want to puff his head up too much, but he's really good. And I think what he's able to do is, continue to treat what I'll call the legal attitude by just questioning it. Why do we always have to say we can't do it? Why don't we figure out what we need to do so we can? That's what led to changing the law in California, by the way. So, and then, we always, we look at this and say, the source data environments and technologies are always tricky because of 2 reasons. One is they do hold sensitive data, and the executives of those organizations don't want anyone, us or anyone else, walking through their systems. So we don't do that at all. Every exchange we do is what we call a handshake at the firewall. And we always automate the architectures that we build to make sure they work. So these are the things that, we would recommend if you're going to take an approach to something like this, it really makes a difference to do it. And we tend to create, demonstration platforms early on in the process so that it really, it invigorates the work of the team when they start seeing how it's going to look. So that's something we again, we found very beneficial. And I don't want to call it prototyping because we don't do it as a throwaway. Right now we have what's called a demonstration alpha prototype that we're just releasing now on one of our projects, and so that lets them see the real thing. So we're that's always a good, I think is always a good approach. Okay, Ethan, I don't know how our time is right now. I'm talking as fast as I can.
No need to rush, Steve. You still have 20 minutes until we're going to get into the discussion, or we can hit discussion early because I'm sure people do have questions.
Wow. Okay. Well, I have the thing on. I have another computer here where I'm running the deck, so I'm ready for each slide before it comes up. So, what do we have after this? Discussion.
Yep, we would head right into discussion. And so if there's anything that you want to cover before we get there, by all means, we can circle back and hit one of those slides again, or we can see who is interested in asking you some questions about secure data environments. What do you think, Steve?
Well, I'm just going to I'm just going to wrap up what I've been saying with a couple of points. One thing that we always face in big projects, and certainly in big government projects that makes it even difficult to get them funded, is the cost and the time it's going to take to get them done. And time to get them done is also factors in how much time it takes to get budgets approved and all that other stuff. Sometimes you're in the works, getting the program off the ground for 2 years before you even get started. This approach, again, it's based upon the fact that you're going to build some new capabilities. We call it, I showed you guys earlier, the services architecture, and we call it a web services environment. And so that World Wide Web is already out there, and the services that can be built can be very, like I said, both secure and flexible. But when you're not worrying about entering data, editing data, doing all of those things. And again, different needs require different approaches. There's no question about it. But because we've created something here that doesn't require us to store all the data because it's already stored in its home environment, and as long as the agencies that we're working with are willing to make it available, when we say make it available, not share it. We're not asking them to share it. We're just asking them if they'll make it available to us. We'll make it available to their partner agencies. And so it's from an economic standpoint, it's much more attractive, and it takes a lot less time to get it all done. But I want to just reiterate, though, that it really depends on what you're setting out to do. If, again, you're looking at something that allows you to bring, data to active decision making, then I think this is the way to go. If you're looking to build a big, research environment, not this. We can contribute to it. We've done one model where we contribute the transaction data to a research platform. But the researchers, this was one of the University of California campuses, they had still to go to the agencies to get the data that they wanted, because we never asked them for it, and we weren't going to, because we didn't want to put the data at risk ourselves. So, but it really depends. What you really want to do is have a big research project, then you've got to do something else. But and lastly, the way we were able to do that is we have a service in this. I didn't talk about it when we were looking at the picture, but it's called transaction logging. So that's the one thing we save, and that's all of the user information and all the transaction information. So it's the date, time, the data access, it's all of that, this is bottom line is this is a transaction processing environment. So all of transaction processing data is saved, and it is put in an environment we call the transaction logging. And those transaction logs from an operational standpoint, and again, this is the recommendation we do with the agencies we work with, is that they appoint someone that we call an operational authority. And usually that's the same person we recommend as the lead for their working groups, because they get very knowledgeable then. But their job is to monitor those transaction logs. So for example, if someone who's not authorized to look at certain data is continuing to try and getting rejected, that's recorded in the transaction log. And if that's happening, that person, has the authority to either, take the person offline and, make sure they know what they're doing is wrong and, get them straightened out, or take it up higher, so the transaction logs are very thorough and they're immediate. So as soon as the transaction's over, it's logged. So that's the back end of this environment. So that's it, Ethan, for me.
Thanks, Steve.
Excellent.
Ethan, if I may, I have received a few direct chat questions for Steve. So maybe just to start priming the discussion, is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, please, by all means. We are at the discussion section, so I am going to pull down the slides as well. So if folks want to use the raise hand feature, by all means. And this way we can see each other a little bit more so that we can have a better discussion. But take it away, Julia.
Thanks, Ethan. And thanks, Steve and Bob. So one question that has come in. So for the individuals who are trying to advocate to set up this type of an SDD in their local jurisdiction, what are the 2 or 3 main talking points that they can share with their local officials or other non-data individuals to get buy-in locally to start implementing this type of program?
I think the first one is creating the ability for data-informed decision-making. And this is and when I say that, it's in an environment where you're often making decisions on the spot. And so this gives you the ability, if there's, we've just as a little bit of a side note here, when we first started looking at the ability to do that, we learned that it was about an average of about 3 months, or about I think it was 3 months. It was either a month or 3 months that it would take them just to find out if if a kid was being served by another agency. Now they find out immediately. And so it really, again, when we're looking at that sort of detection and intervention stuff, that's one important piece of it that you can get a hold of. Second, I think is just the simple fact that there are 0 data exposures. We used something called the General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU's digital government section, because it is recognized worldwide by the big tech guys in Silicon Valley, even though we actually told them about it. But I think we are we have 12, there's 99 articles. We're using 12 of the 99 articles. And the big stuff that we're doing is we'd never expose sensitive data. So it's always encoded into answers to questions. So think of it like if you use your cell phone to go and look to see when the movies are playing at the theater, you're not taking any data from the theater. You're just getting an answer. And so that's a big part of what this is. And so that's why I think it's a real important, aspect of what we're doing, is that this gives them the ability, without having to build warehouses or other files, sets, to have to share data, because the data stays in its home place. And that's where the data comes from for this. And then the final thing is the economics. I mean, I think if you were to do some comparative analysis, you'll see that this is, this is a full arithmetic order of magnitude, less on the, on the time and the dollars that it takes to put the capability in place. Really, the key thing is if that's what you're interested in, is improving coordination of services across agencies, I think that's the argument I think I make.
Thanks, Steve. We just received we have two questions that have just come in. I'm gonna go in order by which I received. Can you speak further on the API technology used to link system members?
The API technology, is that what you said, to link what?
Yes, yeah. So I'll read the whole question again.
Okay.
Can you speak further on the API technology used to link system members?
Okay, so I'm guessing that this is system members are, we're talking about the identification management piece. That's what
participants in the system, the ones on the left and the right. Right. Human services, governments,
but
children and
you're
youth facility,
yeah,
jails.
you're not talking about the user community. You're talking about the client community, right?
Well, you could draw the distinction for me, but let's say yes, the user community.
Okay, well, in the user community, I mean, everything we do is using web services links. So you can say web services link equals API. So we're using a web services framework called Ruby on Rails. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's the one we're using. And so so if it's linking users, it's users are tied or linked to their agencies, and their agencies make the determination as to who will have access to this secure data environment. On the client side, we're using it's a much more complex dimension, but it's one that I think we got lucky, and we use a platform called Sensing with a Z, and it was I'm going to just tell you a little bit of sort of peripheral on this, but the Sensing was the guy who founded that company. He had created the ability to match people with sometimes hundreds of AKAs, and they all sat in the databases in the Las Vegas casinos. They called them the cheaters databases, and they used his product to start finding all these people with all these different names and all that stuff. And the CIA recognized it, and the CIA has a venture fund called Incutel. And during, again, in the height of the counterterrorism work, the CIA, that was their first, that was the first project they funded. And so the stuff that him and his engineering team have done is really amazing. And I know that, there are a lot of companies that have adopted it over the years. I met the founder of the company in 2009 when we were both working in the counterterrorism sector. And so when we started doing this, we said, we started looking at different products, Veritas being one, if you've heard of that. And so we compared the two, and we went without any hesitation at all with the and the guy, by the way, who's the founder, his name is Jeff Jonas. We went with Sensing, and we just did a presentation of how we're doing the person matching stuff across the agencies, and the CTO for Fairfax County, Virginia, who had chosen to use Veritas, he's now changing their standard over to this one. So, and we also had the chief data officer from the Commonwealth of Virginia who, gave them a big endorsement as well. So it's for what we're doing, kids don't have lots of AKAs and that sort of thing. So it works pretty, effortlessly, but it really is. And if you're looking into any of these things, I would strongly recommend that you look at Sensing, Senzing. And if you need any other information on it, I trust that my information will be available to you. I'd be glad to both share that product with you, as well as, have our engineer talk with you about it if you want to if you want to do that.
Great, thank you.
And Tim, does that address your question as far as the technology needed to connect those system members?
Yeah, I was since the data, if it always, from what I understand, since it's and transactions are made across the system back and forth. So I was interested, what's the tech he's using to make those calls? Because whoever's asking the question needs to get an answer back. So I'm just wondering what the framework was. But the Ruby on Rails is fine for me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's the one we're using.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Steve. We got another question, and I think it'd be helpful. So can you give some examples of specific use case scenarios? So, I'll open that up, but possibly also thinking about, an agency starting from scratch and building those partnerships and setting it up. If there's a way, Steve or Bob as well, if you want to talk about some specific examples, maybe targeting also like law enforcement partnerships. So, and police mental health collaboration partnerships, because that's our audience today.
Bob, I'm going to start with the second question, and then you jump in and color it up however you think it's needed. Okay. So we have law enforcement is a big partner right now in the work. The next part of the Silicon Valley work we're doing, which is an implementation of a school threat assessment capability for the county of San Mateo. And are you from, if people are familiar with fusion centers and what they do as their investigative functions, the director of that fusion center is is part of that team. So we have police chiefs who are on that team, as well as what's called the NCRIC, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. And the person who's the director of that, his name is Mike Senna. He's also he's been very helpful to us in that regard, because he's also the president of the National Fusion Center Association. So what we do, and this is something that has worked well for us, when we're going into one of these places where things are still very, I would just say very sort of untouched, is we look at where the leadership is around the country in whatever domain we're looking at. If it's law enforcement, we have very close relationships with the IACP, with the National Sheriff's Association, and so forth. And so we would look at that and ask them, to aim us in the direction of wherever the jurisdiction is. And we have the San Mateo, for example, we have the city of San Mateo police chief on the team too. So, we kind of use the collegial network that's out there to find, who in the region would be, we should talk to get those kind of things off the ground. And it's worked well. And that's if you don't know anybody in the region. If you do, then obviously you start there. And then what was Bob, did you want to add?
No, go ahead, Steve. I'll follow up when you're finished.
I'm sorry. What was the other question?
No, so the central part of the question that Hillary Carson asked was, can you give some examples of specific use case scenarios? And I think the one you were just talking about, like a fusion center, right, that's sort of engaged with the Crime Gun Intelligence Center work, sharing information. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but sharing information about like gun sales and tracking it in that way. So it'd be setting up a system to track individuals in that space, or if you could maybe elaborate on that. And then specifically to Hillary's question, what are some examples of specific use case scenarios of an SDE?
Well, I'll give you two like real different ones. So let's stick with the fusion center, but Fusion Center, in this case, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, gets a volume of threats against schools because they're also an integral part of the police community. And so a big role they play is informing the schools when there's a threat to one of the schools in the region. So that's, and that use case is pretty straightforward. And we, when we looked at that, we looked at, how can we, the use case became, how can we, create, a linkage to them. And it, in this particular architecture, it's not, it's actually facilitated because all we need to determine was the fact that they become another agency. And because we're on the internet, we, they can be in San Mateo County or they can be in the Netherlands for that matter, but they happen to be in San Mateo County. And so the first thing is, how do we connect the agency? And it's a very, we have a process we call a burn-in process, because we have what we call a control agency that we test them with. And once they're in, then it's just starting to define, like in some of the things we were talking about, is doing the data discovery. We figure out what data, is going to be exchanged with the Fusion Center. And, and there's, that's, as the gentleman who was just on the call said, there's questions and then you have to respond. It's then defining what the inquiries are and what the responses to those inquiries are. So that is, and that is actually the use case. But I worked on a different one today for what is a new, we have a client who wants to take a different approach to how they come into the system. And so we're, their access control piece, which is where if you looked at what we were doing here, you see access control at the, at the left side of the screen. They want to come from what I'll call it's an independent data environment that they want to use because they don't want to come from the actual agencies. So we just drafted a use case on what's that going to look like. And again, if you remember I don't know if Ethan can put that one screen up again and I can explain it to you. It's the one that's is the use case example, the use case framework. Ethan, I don't know if you've got it there somewhere, but what we put together was a different kind of use case that talked about how the identity provisioning is done outside of the SDE, and then once the credentials are done, how the SDE validates those credentials, which is with a return back to the the originating point where it was issued from. We'll go back to what are called the lightweight directory access protocols that are being used by this agency as their directory for access. So we go back and we validate that person who came in is actually authorized by that agency and authorized as in a specific role. So that use case is going to be not dissimilar than to what a person comes into the SDE from the more, what I'll call comes in from the SDE through the same access portal. But this defines now it differently because another organization is actually going to be providing that data to us just to get a transaction started. So they're literally anything we can think of. And I have to apologize because I'm not the use case. We have someone who does, pretty much does the use cases because he's very good at getting to the bottom of those things. But it's too bad because I've got probably 60 of them just on the one job we did.
Thanks, Steve. Just in the interest of time, I was just going to see, we did get another question that I think is actually somewhat related to the use cases, because it's a lot of the cases in which I think our audience will be using this is partnering, as Tim brought up, stepping up projects, but also between behavioral health and local hospitals and care providers. So the question is, how are you able to engage legal for hospitals who do not comply with the law, indicating law enforcement should be notified for involuntary placements, mental health petitions when they cite HIPAA violations? So I think, and Olivia, please jump in if I'm not summarizing this correctly, but how do you engage with hospital legal when maybe they have initial pushback due to HIPAA? And I think we can all relate to sort of having HIPAA is a major thing that we're working on in this space, right? That's a key component of the work. So Steve and Bob, if you can talk a little bit about that, is how do you engage with legal from hospitals when they cite HIPAA violations?
Well, I again, Bob, I'll jump in here for a second, and you fill in wherever. But same way we engage with any other agency, what we do is we go, in this case, we would call it the corporate counsel, and let them tell us who they want us to work with. And HIPAA is probably one of the most often cited restrictions that anyone has for sharing information, and it's a little bit. It's a little bit of a lob, because HIPAA it's not really a regulation. It's a practice, and it's a really difficult one, because everybody's afraid of it. And if anybody who goes to the doctor, if you go to the same doctor 2 weeks later, you fill out all that same stuff again. I'm not thinking anybody's going to change that, but what we try to do is work with the chief counsels, and so far we've been successful. And I think it is because we have an attorney who doesn't try to push our way in. He just he continues to ask the questions of why can't and I realize that's not a very good answer, but it's what's been working for us.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. And I think one thing just to note, I think, is like what's so great about this, and you might be able to pull Olivia in for those of you, I've seen a little bit about the HIPAA. There's a lot of questions like this, right, that come in. Being able to describe this as an environment where the data is protected might be the first opportunity to get your foot in the door and to share this as a system. So we hope that these slides and the talking points from these slides and the PowerPoint will help you just first engage with some of that initial legal pushback. But all right, so
Julia, could I just jump in real quick?
please, Bob.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with CSG on the law enforcement mental health and the justice mental health collaboration programs. And we did a lot of work around how to build a data warehouse and so forth. And data warehouse addresses a lot of these same issues, but it's a very expensive. And what we've seen is most of the grantees do not have the funds to do that. And as Steve and I were talking before, that this is an opportunity that maybe is less cumbersome and not simple, but less cumbersome and less expensive to share the data. And some of the appealing factors of it are things like the person identification features that are built into it, which is a huge problem. And no matter what kind of integration you have, you've got to figure out you're dealing with the right person. So that's a big plus. And the other thing is not moving the data. As you law enforcement folks out there know, when you get expungement orders from the courts and so forth, last thing you want is to have to go to 7 or 8 different locations to pull that data back and expunge it because let's say you had a warehouse or some other thing where you physically move the data somewhere. This is not the case here. Your data is in your system. No additional effort is required by you to get rid of a record that's being expunged because the data didn't go anywhere. And if I check it today and it's not expunged, I see that record. And if it's expunged tomorrow, I don't see that record. So you don't have to go chasing everybody that accessed your data last night and say, oh, by the way, that's no longer the case. So those are just a couple of the high points. Steve, you can clean that up if I didn't misstated anything.
I just wanted to jump in for a second because we had a comment from Susan here that I think plays into what you're saying, Bob, because she asked, is there a part of this system that can be used or tracked for research data to look to history in order to do future planning? And based on what you just said, Bob, my understanding is that other than the transaction log, you won't be able to look backwards within this secure data environment. And that is actually one of its strengths, is that you no longer see data that has been expunged, removed, changed. You only are seeing up-to-date data day to day. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll let Steve speak to that.
Ethan, you're correct. This was, and Julia, so were you. I mean, the biggest thing, whether it's Hipaa or, any other, CFR, any other compliance issue, the biggest thing we do is we protect the data. And so in the conversations we've had where Hipaa's come in to the discussions, we've been able to get past it because the councils can see that none of the sensitive data is ever exposed. But and that's the best way to keep it safe, is not to expose it. And then Ethan, on the research issue, as I mentioned earlier, we did some work with the University of California to look at how we might append a research capability, but here's how we were going to do it. So in this secure data environment, the data that we intend to virtually track forever are the transaction logs. And so these transaction logs also identify the data that was changed, all that stuff. And so it just doesn't have any association with a person. But what we talked about doing then is then adding a demographic identifier there, because at least in this in the Silicon Valley, the big interest by the University of California is their research is focused on what we call the underserved communities. And so what they wanted to know is if they had the demographics for it, could we pull all the different transactions that were processed in this environment to give this. And it's was really about looking at, are we making a difference with this? And then coupling that with the data that the university is able to get from, in this case, the counties that are representing those different jurisdictions, because they actually have the case management data and they have the case management histories. So it was looking at how we could couple that with trends in the case management, thinking 6-month and 12-month intervals, and then look at what is has using this environment, looking at all the different transactions that occurred in that demographic, and then being able to make some the whole thing. We're I don't know if we'll ever test it, but that was something that we actually did. We actually went through a design process on it.
Got it. And I have a question here. I'm actually going to pull up one of our slides because I just want to clarify something as far as the day-to-day use of these systems, right? So we're talking about it conceptually and how you might be able to set one of these up, how you can solicit buy-in from your stakeholders. But as far as day-to-day usage, my question is about who has access and what does that access look like? So let's say, I'm working on this opioid use disorder project and I am a law enforcement officer. So I arrested somebody, I booked them, brought them to jail. Am I, as a law enforcement officer, am I going to be able to log on to a computer and use this SDE system to then check the correctional data to see if that person has been released yet? And then beyond that, if I see they have been released, will I be able to then look at human services data and see that they have been connected to some type of service? Or is that a oversimplification of how the actual portal works.
Well, what you're describing is, again, the need for a use case, because I think there's a lot of questions around what you're saying. For example, if you're looking at, and I'm going to be I'm not being smart aleck here, I swear, but if you're looking at status of someone in corrections, corrections has a pretty robust system to tell you that. And certainly things like, release date, release terms and conditions, all those things are things that a law enforcement officer will be able to get from a corrections management system. And Bob knows lots about correction stuff. So this system, I think what it could tell you, and again, I'm not saying there's a rational use of this, other than the other point you made was, if part of their terms of release were putting them into into either, a field supervision program or even a residential program with a community services board or in the human services realm, that is something that you could look at and find out that you could run. Again, I'll keep using you, Ethan, but if you were in jail, you got released, the police can find that out, and as part of the conditions, we would tell them that you're going to be on a community program. You could go to that again. I can't imagine us doing one of these without human services as part of it, but you would be able to go and say, okay, do you have Ethan, in your service? And the answer would be yes.
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification, Steve. I think maybe I used a not perfect example, but what I was trying to get at is our line level staff, right, able to utilize this secure data environment to assist in their day-to-day, to find out information about a particular person, and is that access granted to that staff, or are there other protections in place where only certain people can really query these other systems to find out the human services data, for instance? I just really wanted to drive it home for folks about the practicality of the use.
The bottom line is the agency has to give their staff authorization. So I'll tell you a place that you might not, I was a little surprised, but I'm not anymore, because now I hear all kinds of stuff about this. When we first started working with the schools, nobody wanted to give teachers access, because they were worried if a teacher had access, to information on a student, and they found out the student was in probation, even though they don't get a lot of data, they'll make a lot of assumptions, and they worry about that now coming back on the kid. And so now counselors were different. They had, and again, these were the departments of education they gave the access. We had no restrictions on it. That was up to them. Ethan, there was a slide I don't think we did. I think it was called the Design and Architecture Principles. Is it still there? Because I could point something out real quick to you on that. Yeah, here. So agency control, which is, these are actually kind of in order. So the protections of privacy and confidentiality, but that agency control, that's what that means. And the agency decides who has access. They also decide what data they're going to make available and the form in which they're going to make it available. So the health agency might say, we'll answer a question about treatment, but we're only going to do yes or no. That kind of stuff, because they don't want, there's a lot of sensitivity, especially with kids, of assumptions being made that, could be detrimental to the kid.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, one of the things we did in the corrections information sharing solution, if you inquired on an individual that, let's say, had not signed the consent, it wouldn't say, no, they're not in the program. It would say data not found, because to say they were in custody, but they didn't sign the consent is to divulge information. So by citing data not available or not found, you aren't divulging, oh yeah, they're in here, but they didn't do something. So little things like that can cause problems. So
Got it. And we do have a couple more questions in the chat here. Another one from Tim asking if there is notification functionality to these systems. For example, if a consumer were to show up at an ER and they have a mental health case manager, would it be possible for that mental health case manager to be automatically notified of their entry into the ER?
We don't have one now. We're not doing a notification thing right now because this is about sharing across the agencies. But there's been, we have a concept in, called alerts, warnings, and notifications. And one of my partners is looking at, a strategy on that now. And that would be, something that's, again, in this environment is not, about, branding somebody, but if, the ability to put out a notice that says, if you have, and I'll use Bob May for this one. If you have Bob May, you've got a bad person. And so you need to watch out for this guy. So we haven't done it yet, though.
Got it. And then we also have another question about FOIA and whether that impacts this program at all, as far as being able to monitor people's activity based on those kinds of requests, especially maybe if you're working with like a housing authority.
I wonder if I think my partner's on this call, and boy, he's a guy to answer some of these questions. But I would say nothing from my vantage point. I don't think anything with FOIA is changed by this. So if something comes under freedom of information, I think we're how they want to handle it. That's never come up with us.
Got it. Okay. And so we have just under 10 minutes left here. Folks, if you do have a question that we haven't gotten to, or you have a follow-up, please do chime in. I think we've got time for at least another one or two before we wrap up. And I just want to make sure that all of our bases are covered. Bob and Steve, if there's anything that you think needs a little bit more attention, by all means, jump in. And I think the final question that is probably on a lot of people's minds, or is one that has been referenced, but not necessarily too much information on it. So Steve, you talked a bit about the fiscal impact of setting up one of these systems and that it is advantageous. What would you say, do you have an approximate cost associated with setting up a SDE environment where these organizations can share data with one another?
I have one that I'm fairly confident in, but it's not a very specific answer. In fact, we've been talking about, starting to do our own research on this. But, I think, what a lot of people have learned with data warehouses is that they're expensive. Yeah, and that I'm talking about the platforms, the whole thing, whether you run it in your own environment or whether you run it in a cloud. But the continuing the work on it is also expensive because you've got, and just think about when if you're in a say what I'll call a medium-sized county of a population of say between 1.5 and 2 million people, right? And I don't know if that's medium sized or not, but I come from Los Angeles and we have 10 million something there. But it's when you think about it, I think the biggest thing you're facing is you've got all these systems out there, and it seems like the work to scrub the data before you move it into the data warehouse is gigantic. I've just never seen one yet that didn't go through years of scrubbing data before they, felt confident that they had good, accurate, trustworthy data, because the so many of the systems had just, they had kind of atrophied. But I feel safe saying, again, I think I said it earlier today, that I think it's a full arithmetic order of magnitude. So I think if you're spending hundreds of thousands on something like this, you're going to be spending millions to 10 millions on data warehousing. But we're going to find out about this because we think we need to know.
I do want to make sure we ask this last question, and thank you, Steve and Bob, for your detailed answers to every question. This has been really helpful. So this will be the last question we take, and then we'll wrap up. But this is a question I think I'm really glad was asked, because I was also wondering the same thing. Do you have to go back to square one with a data warehouse when a partner agency changes the underlying database system? For example, jail case management software changed to an entirely new system. We've heard a lot of cases, especially in law enforcement, where maybe a CAD system is being updated, or they've taken 7 years to get the city to approve an update in technology, and then they have to, there can be a lot of dominoes when those things happen. So Steve, Bob, if you can help answer that question again, I'll say, do you have to go back to square one with a data warehouse when a partner agency changes the underlying database system?
I'm going to give you an anecdotal answer, but every time we get into discussions about having to do anything to existing systems, everybody is paralyzed. So, so if you have a data warehouse and, you're now talking, some of the, the police are talking about getting a new records management system, everybody just freezes, like, oh, we just got this thing working and we're going to, have to, go that route. That seems to be something that, and we've run into it, but when we explain that we don't care what system you have, if you want to change it, because all we're doing is doing a web services connection to your environment for very specific data that you've authorized being accessed, and I shouldn't say access, again, made available. That's all we care about. So we don't have the same problem as the data warehouse, because what they do with data is it's, have you ever been a programmer?
I don't know if you're talking to me, but no.
I'm talking to you. Well, what that looks like as a program is as far as the eye can see, is a bunch of what we call move statements. So it's move, and that's from this field to this field, from this field to this field, and it's really kind of rotten stuff to have to do. But at the end of the day, if you're going to have a data warehouse, you're going to have to be pretty exact. You're going to have to be 100% exact if you're pulling data from other systems. The bigger issue, to be honest with you, is in fact the actual the issues with the content of the data, not so much the structure or the naming of it. So data warehouse is a different commitment than something like this secure data environment, because for all intents and purposes, we exist for the duration of the transaction, and that's it. Few seconds.
Okay, and so what I'm hearing is that even if there is a change in someone's data platform that they're using, that does not actually impact the SDE that has already been created that includes them.
Yeah, we don't, to answer the question, we don't have to go back to square one. Now, we still have to do, we still have to go to the agency and say, this is the data we're collecting for you now. Still want us to collect it? Is that what you want to make available to the other agencies? That kind of stuff. So we'd still have to do that, but the connectivity and all that other stuff, and it can be almost as simple as just plugging it in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we are right at 3:30, and so I want to just take a moment to thank everyone for attending today. We do appreciate your questions, your your attention, and a big thank you to Steve and to Bob from the IGES Institute. By all means, we will be sharing their information. The recording of this webinar will be up on our website shortly, along with the slides. You can see here ways to contact me if you have any further questions, as well as a link to our newsletters, which I do highly encourage that you take a look at, because we have put out some great resources on information integration and things like that. So once again, thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your day, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.